Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's great to have you join us wherever you are in the world today. And we're very privileged to have two more thought leaders join us as we continue our discussion around the theme of the role of education in enhancing lifelong well-being outcomes for military service members, veterans, and their families. Before I introduce our two thought leaders for today, I just want to remind you that if you have comments or resources you'd like to share, please include them in the chat stream. And if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Well, it's my privilege today to introduce our two thought leaders who are going to be sharing with us around the topic of military inclusive higher education in England, the current situation, and a future vision. And I'm sure Graham and Michael will share a bit more around that, but I think a large part of the focus is going to be about a vision for the future. And that will be useful, I suspect, to many of us in our individual countries as we too are thinking about where to in the future in terms of the role of education. Yeah, our two thought leaders today, you have their full bios in your info packs, but my pleasure now to introduce them. Firstly, Dr. Graham Cable. Graham is a research fellow at the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre at Veterans and Families Institute for Military Social Research at Anglia Ruskin University. And his co-presenter is Dr. Mike Almond. Mike is professor at the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre, also at the Veterans and Families Institute at Anglia Ruskin University. Both are veterans and both have been looking at this issue from slightly different angles, but have met in the middle, would be my summation. And from my personal experience, I think are going to share with us some very interesting ideas and thoughts and experiences that will be very useful to many people. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Graham and Mike and invite you to share with us.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm assuming you can hear me unless you shake your head or something. Yeah, you can, you've got a thumbs up. Thanks very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. It's quite late at night here in the UK, where Mike and I will be talking to you from. But delighted to be here. Robert has introduced and given a bit of background to me and to Mike later on, but just as you see there, I've recently been asked to act as our university's Armed Forces Community Engagement Lead. And really, that's what this presentation from Mike and I is about. It's about engaging with the Armed Forces community in and around our university. And to an extent, we're already doing that, but we feel that more can be done. And what we're going to do tomorrow, in fact, is present to our university's senior leadership about this vision and what we think should be done. And I don't wish to cast you as guinea pigs, but to a degree, we are trial running this presentation on you. And it'd be interesting to see your discussion and Q&A, et cetera, at the end to see whether it struck any chords and what you think. So what we want to do is really pitch this to our senior leadership tomorrow and grasp this nettle and really make this work. So thanks for being here for us, and we'll see how this goes. Aside from the university's Armed Forces Community Engagement Lead, a new role, a new venture, my day job is, as Robert said, a research fellow in the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre. More of that in a second. And again, as Robert mentioned, I'm a veteran of the British Army, and I was an Education Training Services branch officer. So in theory, at least, I should know something about what we're about to talk about. And the next slide just briefly gives you an overview of the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre there. So you'll get this slide back at the end of it. And these images and the links are active, so it'll be able to take you to the information should you wish to have a look. But if you just have a a quick look at those bubbles there. As it says, and as Robert said, we're part of the Veterans and Families Institute for Military Social Research at Anglia Ruskin University, but we're set up to support the Forces in Mind Trust, which commissions research into the communities that we're looking at here. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to have a look at those bubbles and find out what we do. And more information, should you require it when you get the packs, is available at the links. I think many of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with what we're trying to achieve by way of these webinars and the various international groups we engage with and the work we engage with in our own institutions. The quotation there, I think, puts it very well, 2014. Again, the link will take you to the publication from. Just a few seconds to have a quick look at that. And then in a recent August publication, authored by some cove called Cable, accompanied by someone called Almond and another chap from Canada called Cathcart, who may well be on this webinar as well, we extended it to state the following. And again, a few seconds, have a look at that. So again, you'll all be familiar with this. And this is really what we are attempting to do in our own institution, our own HEI, and what this presentation is all about. But military inclusivity is not just about serving personnel and veterans. And what we want to do is address that and talk about that in this presentation, which will be presented in three parts, if you like. I will talk about initially the Armed Forces community educational context, just to set the scene. And then we will be looking at homing in, if you like, on England-specific considerations. Now, this is important because, as you'll be aware, the United Kingdom is made up of 4 nations, each with slightly different, if you think about England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, slightly different educational systems. And then when you look at Scotland, a vastly different educational system. That will become more apparent as we go through the presentation here. So many of you will have already heard from our Scottish colleagues about what they are doing north of the border. And what they're doing north of the border will necessarily be slightly different to what we do in England because of those differences in the educational system. So I will provide a sort of pan-UK understanding of the armed forces support for education, if you like, and then move towards England-specific or English-specific considerations. And then Mike will pick that up in the second main part of the presentation, where he'll look at the Armed Forces community landscape with a focus on the English context, and then talk about our vision, what we would like to happen next. And then at the end, we'll invite some discussion and Q&A. So looking at the UK military connected educational context first, UK MOD, the Ministry of Defence, as in all our nations, I'm sure, invests in accrediting mandatory military training qualifications alongside civilian qualifications by mapping those military training qualifications as far as is possible to civilian equivalents, and also incentivizing, including by offering financial assistance, more of which later, additional elective, personally chosen personal development courses, so that when military personnel, and this is predominantly regular personnel, some categories of reserve personnel enjoy some of these benefits as well, but not all. So it's predominantly regular. And why do they do this? Well, the 3 R's. It's good for recruitment. If you're seen to invest in personnel like this, then you might attract the much needed volunteers to join in the first place. By offering a through service package, which gets incrementally better the longer you serve in terms of financial incentivization and the training courses that you attend, and therefore the accreditation possibilities is good for retention. And then finally, when someone resettles or transitions back into civilian life, they've got a range of qualifications hopefully available to them to enable them to access employment and perhaps further education and higher education more easily than they might otherwise do so. Now, this accreditation of military qualifications and elective qualification offerings range from secondary educational qualifications to apprenticeships, so that the British Army, to use an example, has recently been recognised as the UK's foremost provider of apprenticeships, which I'm sure you all understand, but are a way that you can be working, you can be paid, but also gaining qualifications by that initial introduction to the workplace, so that you become a qualified engineer, for example. And those qualifications can range from secondary school qualifications up to further education, as we describe it in the UK, or vocational qualifications, and even bachelor's level degrees. So that once you've qualified in that workplace, you can be leaving with a bachelor's degree as well. It also extends to other vocational qualifications, further education qualifications, and on through to higher education and professional memberships. And if you remember at the beginning, I didn't just gratuitously pepper my name with a few letters there, but that's just an example of me using those military accreditation opportunities and the funding for my own personal development to eventually get my doctorate, and also a membership of the Chartered Institute for Linguists, because I was a language specialist in the army, amongst other things. So by doing the military language qualifications, I automatically got membership of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, and likewise the Chartered Management Institute, by virtue of being a leader in the British Army, if you like. And it's important to point out here that whilst there is funding and incentivizations for serving personnel and veterans, as we'll come on to see, there isn't anything for family members, except in exceptional circumstances. And again, I'll come on to those. So some more points on the military connected context, just to set the scene before Mike takes over. There are around 199,000 regular and reserve serving personnel, or there were. Last time it was, the figures were published by the MOD in April this year. 15,000 leave every year, which adds to the 2.5 million veteran population in the UK. And of course, some sadly will pass away, but with the 15,000 joining, it's stable at around 2.4 million veteran population in the UK, plus of course families. Now, military connected, the military community includes, I think for most of us in our definitions, the families. And estimates would put that population with the veterans and their families at around 10 million. Now, beginning to move towards the English-specific support and opportunities that this might provide us in the HEI context, the Higher Education Institute context in the UK. When serving in the military, full-time personnel, predominantly some categories of reserve, can enjoy undergraduate and postgraduate courses, and some of those can be provided by external HEIs, external higher education institutes or further education institutes. So this provides an opportunity for these institutes, for our institutions, to provide some of those courses and to reap the financial rewards that they offer, as well as engaging with the community and reaping the rewards that the engagement with the community, as Mike will go on to talk about, can yield as well. Now, these opportunities can be fully or partly funded by the MOD. They will be fully funded if part of a service person's career development. And there's also what's called a publicly funded further and higher education scheme available to serving personnel in the last 2 years of their service, or for up to 10 years after serving as a veteran, if they do not already have a first degree. Now, this is one of the differences between the English, Welsh, and Northern Irish education system and the Scottish system, in that in the former 3 countries, any student who attends a higher education course has to pay around £9,000 a year tuition fees. Now, in Scotland, for Scottish residents, that is free, or the contribution is much, much smaller. So by the MOD offering to fully fund a 3-year traditionally undergraduate course for serving personnel in their last 2 years, so it would be part-time, or a part-time or full-time degree course when they leave, that is a great advantage to them personally under the English, Welsh and Northern Irish systems. Now, what I don't know is that if a service person leaves and when they leave, they are resident in England, if they then move to Scotland, they will be classed under the Scottish system as a resident in Scotland, and therefore, like other Scottish students, will attract a much reduced course fee. If not, then they can also in Scotland enjoy this publicly funded further and higher education grant. So that is a really useful incentive. It doesn't provide them with any living costs, and I understand that the GI Bill in the US can do that. So they have to look elsewhere, student loans, etc., to if they need assistance with their living expenses. Aside from that, if they don't take advantage of the publicly funded further and higher education scheme, any serving person who has served for, there are two tiers. One is double the other. So this is the higher tier, but if you serve for over 8 years, you can access the higher tier. And if you serve for between 6 and 8 years, you can access the lower tier. But in the higher tier, a service person can apply for up to 80% or up to a maximum of £2,000 a year to study what amounts to a higher secondary education level qualification up to a doctorate in the further education and higher education sphere. So that's a useful incentive. And that's what I use for the first 3 years of my doctorate in education as well. So, you know, I was very grateful to have been afforded that. It reduced the costs significantly. And as mentioned throughout, the bottom two bullets there apply predominantly to regular serving personnel and veterans. Some categories are reservists, but not many. And in terms of veterans, they can use those for up to 10 years after leaving the armed forces. So that's, you know, a significant period in which they can access those grants and undertake courses in further or higher education. And I mentioned that limited means were available to family members, and this is one of those limited means. But where a serving person or a veteran is ill or injured as a result of something that happened to them during service, or unfortunately, if they pass away, then their partner or a nominated proxy can enjoy those benefits as well. But that's the only financial benefit that is available to family members. Now, interesting, the take-up of all of these among serving personnel and veterans is relatively low. I think the highest it is during service is about 25%. In fact, it's 25% in all, but up to in the last 2 years of service, where it's miraculously jumps, and not surprisingly jumps actually to about 50%. And among veterans, it dips again. So it, you know, there is low take up, and I think this provides an opportunity to us in the higher education arena to ensure that the armed forces community are aware of this. And I know that the onus perhaps is on the MOD to publicise this, but so we can also do our part in publicising this. And as Mike will go on to indicate, you know, this is a financial opportunity, quite apart from all the other opportunities that we should consider seizing. Some HEIs in England, and the Open University, albeit a kind of distance learning university, as I know most of you will know, is based in England, has a disabled veterans scholarships fund available to assist veterans as well, additionally to any other funding they can get. So some universities are seizing on this. And I think you will have heard a presentation recently from Dave Mather from the University of Portsmouth. That's where I did my first undergraduate degree, so I have a bit of interest in the university. But I think that University of Portsmouth is a particularly good example of targeting the armed forces community. And the link there, when you get the presentation, will take you to some of those offerings from the University of Portsmouth. There are others, but I just want to give you a flavour of what's going on. Scotland, on the other hand, and unlike England at present, has a network of champions for the further education, higher education arena. And you will have heard many of you a presentation from my Scottish colleagues that talked about that. And I've mentioned it has a different fee structure. So England, Wales and Northern Ireland are different, and we're focusing specifically on England in this presentation. Much of this is summarised in our education training research snapshot produced by the Forces and Mind Trust Research Centre. And again, the link will take you to that. So if I've confused you or if I've rambled on too much, then click on that link and it'll explain much of what I've already gone through. But I think we'd all agree, and certainly Mike and I would agree, that we must do better in England, at least in some of our institutions. That includes our own. And this is my last slide here before I hand over to Mike. Anglia Ruskin University has signed the Armed Forces Covenant. It did so, our Vice Chancellor did, our university leader did so in 2016. Now, the Armed Forces Covenant is, as the name suggests, a covenant that exists in the UK that encourages organisations and local government, particularly, to ensure that serving armed forces personnel and veterans are not disadvantaged under local authority provision, for example, by dint of their service. So where, for example, they're constantly moving around when serving, that previously could disadvantage them if they decided to settle somewhere in a local authority area in England and then applied for social housing, they would be at the bottom of the list because they didn't have a history of residence in that local authority. Now, clearly that was deemed unfair. It wasn't their fault they were posted around various locations in the UK and internationally and didn't have a history. So what that seeks to do is ensure that the disadvantage is removed. It doesn't give them an advantage. They won't leapfrog people, but they will give them parity. They'll be given parity of access alongside people who do have a history of residence in a local authority area, for example. But in terms of higher education and what ARU committed to do by signing the Armed Forces Covenant was to recognise the value serving personnel, regular and reserves, veterans and military families contribute to, in this case, our institution, and more broadly to the local area and to the nation, to promote the university as an armed forces friendly higher education institution, to support the employment of veterans by, for example, providing work placements and briefing days, especially for wounded, injured and sick via, and I have to look this up, I can never remember what it is, the university's in support of wounded, injured and sick service personnel programme. It is also a member of the Defence Employer Recognition Scheme. So it has to become a member, it has to demonstrate that it employs members of the Reserve Armed Forces and veterans and families, and that it looks after them and supports them. And again, more information is available to both of those programs and schemes at those links. It also supports employment of the partners of the above. It develops courses in consultation with military sponsors and where possible accredits military training, as we've already looked at. It develops courses for partners and especially looks to do that in a flexible and online format because, again, partners will find themselves often moving around frequently, so it makes sense to enable people to study flexibly and online. And it also, I've got to move the little Zoom window here so I can read my bottom bullets. It offers flexibility around military deployment of reservists. So where reservists have to deploy, then their employment will be held open or their courses might be deferred, etc. To accommodate that. And it seeks to and commits to publicise and feed back on the above to the Armed Forces Covenant motor, an engine, if you like. Now, so I said that was the last slide, the penultimate one. There are some other considerations that we haven't covered there and committed to, if you like, and this is what Mike is going to go on to and look at in some more detail. We haven't really looked at what we can do to provide or attract or incentivize children of the military community that we've talked about there. And research indicates that fewer go into HE than the general population. So this is an area that we do need to look at, and indeed agencies are looking at it. The universities, again, I've got to look this up, University and Colleges Admission Service that essentially is the vehicle into colleges and universities for those applying, is now beginning to track forces connection and progression amongst those applying to university and colleges. And the Service Children's Progression Alliance, again, information available at these links, is also doing the same and much else besides to promote access of service children to educational opportunities. And if I'm not mistaken, that is all I have to say. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and invite Mike to pick up from there.
Thank you, Graham, and good evening, morning, afternoon to everyone on the call this evening. As Graham said, I'm afraid we are using you as guinea pigs, so I'd like to suspend your intimate knowledge of this subject and now pretend that you're sat there as a finance officer or a chief executive or a vice chancellor of a university that knows very little about the military-friendly campus. And do tell us that we've missed the mark completely, or we should have talked about this, and in your experience you must mention something else. So do feedback at the end, because we want to hear what you think. Now, those of you who don't know where we are, actually, I've put a little map of England there, and the red area is Essex, which has one of two big campuses that Anglia Ruskin has. We have one in Chelmsford, and that's the photograph at the top there, the nice green, and the River Chelmsford flowing through it. And the other campus is in Cambridge. And for those of you in the United States online, the picture of the house there, I live about 20 minutes from the campus, and the picture of the house there is where a chap called Christopher Martin planned the Mayflower voyage. So that 500-year experiment that we call the United States started there. We're still waiting to find out how it turned out. Now, veterans in Essex aren't particularly new, but I'm going to talk about all these things, and they're going to be broad brush. So I don't want to get into the various weeds, and we've talked a little bit about places like Portsmouth. So this is going to be a broad brush picture of how things are in the UK. And in Essex, we've actually had veterans for about 2,000 years. Those of you who remember Monty Python, and what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, they provided us with running water, central heating, and roads, but they also gave us veterans with some cash. And the veterans tended to stay where they were last posted to. And Colchester, which is in Essex, has our 16 Air Assault Brigade. That's where they're based, and they are built on the old Roman settlement. Within the military camp there, there's evidence of the old hippodrome where they used to do chariot racing. Shakespeare's been there before us. He's described everything, and we can blame him for the attitude we have in England, perhaps, to veterans. Pistol appears in 3 of Shakespeare's plays, and he is a fairly unpleasant character, getting into fights. He's a racist, and by that I mean he doesn't like the Welsh. There's a particularly nasty episode involving a leak, which certainly won't be allowed in the military today. He's got one good line. You probably all remember the line of the world is my oyster. And that's a famous phrase that people use. Actually, what they don't remember is the next line. He says, and I'll open it with my sword, to describe how he can sort of leave the military and go and conquer the world as a veteran. And it's very unlikely that he was going to plan to go to Cambridge, a university which did exist at the time that he was in the military, but it was unlikely that he was going to be going to Cambridge University after he left the Battle of Agincourt. Now, when we look at the English landscape, we have to use a bit of a crystal ball and a fairly powerful lens, because we do start out with pretty much a blank sheet of paper. Graham's already mentioned the Armed Forces Covenant, whose main purpose is to make sure that people in or having left the military aren't disadvantaged. It's not there to produce any advantage. Graham mentioned the employer recognition scheme, but that does what it says on the tin. That looks at people who are employed in the university and hasn't really got very much to say, if anything, about veteran students. We have the degrees at work system, and that is actually well embedded and works well, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll also mention a little bit more about the Universities and Colleges Admission Service, which is how people in England get into university. It's a national system, and you apply through the UCAS system to get into university, or at least 98% of students get into university via that route. Now, if I use the word cadet, I'm talking about children under the age of 18 and their adult volunteers. The adult volunteers are unpaid and they have no liability to be mobilized and deployed. Regulars are fairly obvious. We know what they are. They are people who are full-time employed by the military and have an overseas liability. We do have students at university who wear a uniform, but they're primarily, in the first instance, students who join the Officer Training Corps or the University Air Squadron or the naval equivalent. And I know that Graham was in the Officer Training Corps, which is how he ended up joining the Army. And I was in the University Air Squadron, which is why I've done 32 years as a medical officer in the RAF Reserves. But they aren't liable to military service either. They're there to learn the skills of being an officer, or in my case, all I ever learned was to fly a plane. Reservists in the UK come in many, many different guises. And when somebody says they're a reservist, there are lots of different types. You can do full-time reserve service, part-time reserve service, volunteer ex-regular reserve, and you can also be a veteran and a reservist. And then clearly you can be a veteran and you don't have any long-term mobilization, and clearly you can be a veteran till the day you die. So when I use the words, those are what I'm going to be talking about. And words do matter. Most people, when they think of England, they think of changing the guard at Buckingham Palace and the Queen's birthday parade on horse guards, and they get the assumption that we're a very militarized country. But actually we're not. When I visit the USA or even Australia, I'm surprised by the number of people I see in uniform out shopping, buying petrol. That does not happen very much in the UK generally. And the reason behind that, of course, predominantly reflects our experiences with internal problems and Northern Ireland, which went on for 2 decades. And I did serve in the 70s and 80s, and we would be in trouble if we were seen out in uniform. That was forbidden. So the military on the streets of the UK are fairly hidden. And that's why terms like armed forces and military and things like that don't necessarily go down well, and don't go down well, particularly on campuses. So when we're trying to think what we want to call this uniformed services connected campus, we can pick any one of the column of number 1, throw in number 2, and end up with number 3. And I don't think we've actually settled on what we want to call the program that we're trying to develop within the university. And we're not alone in that, because the little clip at the bottom there was written by a veteran who was really rather jaundiced about the title of a veteran-friendly campus, because that just implied you gave a coffee shop somewhere to which veterans were entitled. Now, we mustn't forget that universities are a business. And when I'm presenting this tomorrow, I will be talking to people who see the university not as a place to necessarily teach, but in order to make a profit. So it's a business, and universities are what we call anchor institutions. These are big organizations embedded in the local community. They own lots of land, they buy things locally, they employ people who have to live locally, and they connect with other anchor institutions. For example, on the Chelmsford campus, we have a lot of health and social care students doing medicine, nursing, paramedics, and social workers. And they're clearly very intricately linked with our National Health Service. And the hospitals locally employ 12,000 people, and they are linked into the community, their anchor institutions, and they work very closely together. And we must be aware when we start to talk about how we link the universities to the military connected people, that they're also linked to these other anchor institutions. And as I say, the military connected people, so that's a fairly broad term, these are an untapped resource, both for the university and the community that surrounds the higher education institution. They occupy rented accommodation, they use the local supermarkets. And for the individual or the family and the society, they're also enablers, or education is enabler for them. So if we start at the bottom of the family, and we'll start with service children, there are about 76,000 service children. And by those numbers, what I'm talking about those are children who are in school today, whose parent or parents are currently serving. There are a lot more whose parents have served and have now left the military. So the definition that we probably will be using, although it's not accepted nationally, is the little definition at the bottom, whereas you're classed as a service child if your parents have served in the regular or the reserve forces at any point in 25 years. The Student for Office Affairs recognise that children from military families are vulnerable. And we know that they're vulnerable. You all know that they're vulnerable because they get moved around, and it's not unusual to hear children of sort of 18 years of age saying they've been to 6 schools with 6 different curriculums, 6 friendship groups. And as you heard from Graham, if they move from England to Scotland, then they have to cope with a completely different system. At times, one parent can be deployed, and so they become in effect for long periods, particularly in the Navy, who can deploy overseas for up to 12 months. Then you can be a single parent for over a year. Paradoxically, we know that service children achieve well. They're tracked up to the age of 16 because schools get an extra allowance for having a service child of about £500 per year, which may not be very much if you've got one service child in your school. But if you're next to a big garrison and you've got several hundred children in your school, then that's a big income stream for that school. That, however, stops at 16 and there's no tracking. So children at school are lost between the age of 16 to 18. And because of that, we're not sure how many are attracted into higher education. Now, schools recognize there's an economic value in military children, particularly if you want to send them to your archetypical British boarding school. And you decide that because you're a mobile family, you'll send your children to school. And again, the military will help fund sending your children to a boarding school. And there are lots of adverts. If you sort of Google or you are in the officer's mess and you read the Soldier magazine or the Officer magazine, you will see adverts for schools. I have yet to see a single advert that says you should send your school to a particular university. And I have a sneaky suspicion that the first university that starts to tap into that population, providing they've got something to sell as to why military children should come to that university, will probably be able to cash in. Graham mentioned the Service Children Progression Alliance, and we are now just starting to ask people when they apply to university, did your parent or carer serve in the military? Now, we were supposed to have done that this year, but I don't know if it's the pandemic that stopped it, but one of a colleague of Graham and I at the university, her son is currently applying to university using the UCAS form, and they can't find this question. It does say that when you answer this question, the university or college may provide support. Again, I've got no evidence as to what that support would be, and it goes on to say it will be monitoring and inform and improve. Again, I've got no evidence as to what monitoring or how that's going to be done. This little graph here was taken from the University of Winchester, who worked with the Skip Alliance. And on the bar chart at the top there on the left, I don't know if my pointer works, but these are the 100% of children. About 50% of kids in the UK go to university. And in the general population, that's shown here. But of those who say their parents were in the military under the old scheme, we're down to about 25 to 30%. And this little red box here are people who are missing from the university. Now, it may be just an accounting error, so that your parent may have served for 17 years as you grow up, but they suddenly leave at the age of 17 and go and work for a bank or British Airways or something like that. And that's the day you fill in the UCAS form, and the question says, what does your parent do? And you say they work for the bank or British Airways. You don't get recorded as being a military child in the old UCAS system. And as I say, as far as I know, that question, did your parents serve at any point during your 25 years, that question was missing even from this year. And not surprisingly, the outcome of that study that Winchester did suggested there should be a different way of looking at the military child, and that the children should be wrapped up in a bigger support bubble covering the universities, schools, authorities, and so forth. So where are we with military children? We may only just at the point of recording their status, and I'm still a bit skeptical about where we are with tracking and developing admission criteria, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, and what I call the admission pathway. That's how you attract a child and what you can do to support a child into higher education and into your particular university. So what of the spouse? How are we getting on with the military spouse? UCAS do provide some advice, as Graham mentioned, but that advice is more about apply for courses that do distance learning or part-time learning and provide an ability to change providers. So if you're moved from Colchester to Catterick, you can take your learning credits from, let's say, Anglia Ruskin up to somewhere like Leeds. However, there is nothing specific mentioned about how you should be able to cope with separation when your serving spouse gets deployed, how you can manage when you take on the extra caring role. And we know that the spouse of serving have trouble with employment, even part-time work, because they struggle to get work, and therefore finances and the ability to do or to study is much reduced. There's a lot more said in the literature about employing spouses than there are in supporting education. And there's a complete absence of research in England or in the UK writ large. There's, as far as I am aware, there's only one paper really that's been looked at how and why military spouse, or in this case, actually they call them military wives because it was in the Gender and Education Journal, but they looked at military wives and they pointed out that we don't know what proportion of military wives access higher education, what courses they choose and why. So we recognize that we know very little about spousal education. Regulars are pretty well looked after, and every university can point to something that they call the military program. So if you're a regular serving in the military in the UK, you can probably find a course, providing the caveats that Graham mentioned earlier on, they are part of your career progression, and the military will therefore give you time and money, and they will pay for the course. A lot of these are designed to work in the military, so there's a lot of engineering courses out there, and they're known as work-based degrees or degree apprenticeship. So regulars are pretty well looked after from my point of view. But again, there's a lack of tracking completion head counts and what happens to people when they get their degree. Do they use them subsequently? But importantly, again, as Graham said, if you're regular serving, then your military qualifications are usually recognized and there's some transfer of credits. However, it's not as easy as you find, for example, in Canada. It's very easy for me in the UK to Google Canadian universities, and I can find lists of training courses and credits that will be made available. I think that's the New Brunswick University. And in Manitoba, you can contact a military support office, which is something that doesn't exist in our universities. I'm told other Canadian universities are available. That's not an advert. Now, for reservists, if you look there, a lot of information revolves around, as I said, the students who join the Officer Training Corps or the equivalent. There's very little research done on people who are members of the, what you might call the active duty reservist, who are liable to call up a mobilization. There's a lot of things directed towards employing of reservists, and this is back to the employer recognition scheme. So employing a reservist, anything from employing a professor or employing somebody who works in facilities, there's a lot about that, and the employer recognition scheme recognizes and to some extent rewards the university for doing that, but they don't reward or recognize universities for having students on campus who are active reservists. Having said that, some universities are a little bit more intelligent, and I certainly have deployed with students who were having bits of their course sent to them in South Sudan and recognize their deployments and can continue their training remotely. So there are some educated universities who do support reservists through training and deployments. Veterans, we have a lack again of research. There's no need to record or track veterans in higher education. And bizarrely, if you leave the military and you're no longer a regular and you apply to university, a lot of your previous military qualifications time out very quickly. So if you're still serving, you may have done a course many years ago, but because you're serving, the university will recognize that as a regular. But when you become a veteran, suddenly you seem to have forgotten all the training that you had in the military, and your military qualifications are not recognized in the same way. Again, we don't really have any pathways to admission. And again, I don't mean passing exams, or what I'm talking about is we don't run specific summer schools for veterans to invite them to look around universities to discuss how to get into university. Everything again is much more employment related. When somebody's in transition, we know about 20% of the 15,000 that leave every year in the UK recognize that they need further training or higher education. But very few universities reach into the transition programs to say, have you thought about coming to Anglia Ruskin University? And we don't have a national or even at Anglia Ruskin University, a student organization. There's nothing, there is no peer support, or there's nobody they can contact to say, if I apply here, how is life as a veteran? There is on the UCAS application form, another box to say, are you a veteran? And it promises all the same things again. We will provide you support, we will track you, we will monitor you, and we will improve. But again, I've got no evidence that anybody is there to track or monitor that promise by ticking that box. Now, of course, none of this is new, and we had a brilliant session that I think the Journal of Veteran Studies organized a while ago with this sociologist, Willard Waller, who unfortunately died very young, just at the end of the Second World War, and he never saw the GI Bill arrive, but he wrote a very good book with a very prescient chapter, and in that, the chapter says that, you know, when a university assesses somebody for entering a university, they should know and recognize that somebody who's been a commissioned officer or a non-commissioned officer is pretty switched on. They know how to run things. Your junior officers and your seniors who ran forward operating bases in Afghanistan, they know how to run a business. You know, they know that things need supplied and things need replaced, and they know how to look after welfare and things like that. And we should capitalize on that and not regard veterans as the ancient pistol of Shakespeare's, and we should recognize them much more as the young switched on people in the main that come out of the military after a lot of investment in the 21st century. Now, who's meant to recognize that? Well, it's the staff and the faculty. And I've kept mentioning the admissions pathways. Well, yes, some of that may very well be that if you're a military child and you've been moved from pillar to post over 12 years at school, then maybe you should be identified as a military child, and perhaps a slight reduction in the qualifications needed to get onto a course should be taken into account. Because if you can get a B and 2 Cs whilst being moved up and down the country half a dozen times, then actually you're probably as good as a student who got straight A's who went to a public school under the private system. We perhaps ought to offer military spouse and military veterans summer schools to bring them into a campus, to take away some of the mystique, but we have to have something to sell. We have to be able to say to them, come to this campus because, and this is how you apply, and these are the pros and the cons, and the understanding that we have of you as a veteran, a military child, or a spouse. We need to help facilitate that transition. I've talked about dipping into the transition process, and we have the career. It's called a career transition program, which implies it's a career, it's a job. There's nothing to say that you've got an education transition program where universities dip into that. There still is that little bit of fear of veterans, and I'm ashamed to say that I've heard it said that we don't want all those shouty, sweary people coming onto a health campus, that, you know, a veteran is not the sort of person we want in a health, despite the fact that, of course, the military run a fantastic health service. The staff have no development. We, as you heard from Graham, we've just appointed our Armed Forces champion, but he's a one-man band. Hopefully tomorrow we'll start to introduce the idea that there should become some curriculum planning. There is for regulars in terms of part-time learning and distance learning, but nothing for anybody else. And whilst we all get diversity and inclusion and health and safety on induction, nobody ever mentions to the students or the staff that you may or you will in the future come across veterans. And there's certainly no staff or student organization. And as I said, there's no student organization. So not surprisingly, there's no military connected staff organization either who can work along with them. Clearly, the majority of veterans are by definition mature students. And mature students come with a bit of baggage, family and children and so on. And so the university needs to think about whether or not it should incorporate a housing policy in its military connected campus. And I mentioned anchor institutions, and there are big housing associations and rental organizations and even house building organizations who could probably work with the university. And those companies that run rental, housing rentals and house builders are probably part of this employer recognition support system and probably have signed the covenant. And there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't work hand in glove with the university. The university needs to think about childcare because it's more likely or not that veterans will come with children. And in the UK, we have a small proportion of our general practitioners, our family health services, are now recognised as being veteran friendly. And those NHS practices have undergone some form of training. And again, the university should work with those local veteran friendly practices to direct, particularly veteran students, reservists and so on, to those practices. Talking about part-time employment there, let's take a non-commissioned sergeant, staff sergeant, engineer who has all the skills to drive cranes, forklift trucks, and knows how to work in the engineering industry or the building world. Again, there's absolutely no reason why somebody who comes to a university to do a degree in engineering now can't work with the university and the local employers who again are accredited veteran employers to work with the university to make sure that students can seek employment. And I mentioned safe space there. I know that got a bit of a panning by one of the people who wrote the article on an earlier slide about, you know, we don't just want a safe space. But if that safe space includes places where the veteran or the student can get advice on finance and understand all the stuff that Graham talked about, the local employers who want to employ veterans, who are veteran-friendly employers, can help work with them. And also the big industries who have a tie-in with the military, like British Aerospace and Kinetic, then they can offer bursaries, because when this senior non-commissioned officer who's worked in engineering in the military leaves with his degree, he's leaving with a degree and a wealth of military and industrial experience. And those people should be supporting the student, the veteran student, through their university, because they're going to come out with the skills that they're going to want as employers. When we look at the community engagement piece, there are 1,000 cadets in Essex, and the facilities of the university, the cadets would love to have a chance to explore the facilities of the university, usually in the science, technology, education and medicine sort of area. Or the staff from the university can go out to the cadets, because the cadets of today are the university students of tomorrow, and the university can sell the university to the cadets. And if they can offer them the chance whilst they're at university to join the officer training corps or join the reserves and continue their military experience, then that's a huge win-win. We have 7 reserve units in Essex. Essex is pretty small. You can drive across it in an hour and a half, but we have 7 reserve units in Essex. We have a medical unit which can tie in with the medicine, nursing and paramedic faculties. We have engineering units. We even have the only reservist police and prison custody unit in Essex. And on campus, we have a policing institute which runs one of the biggest apprenticeship degree system for the police. So there's lots of opportunities to work with cadets and reserve organizations locally. One of the big things we have in England are the veterans breakfast clubs, which have been very successful to provide a lot of mutual support for veterans. And of course, the campus has lots of catering space, and it would be wonderful to have the veterans come on board during the day and the university to offer space for veterans organizations. And the same applies for supportive employers and people who will employ veterans. Last week in the UK, we had an Armed Forces Week and an Armed Forces Day. We have that, or we have had that now every year for about a decade. It was clearly affected a little bit by the lockdown and COVID, but we had to prompt the university to send out a sort of an email to remind everybody it was Armed Forces Day. We do hold a November the 11th, our sort of Armistice Day. We have held services at the university, but the university could certainly do more to hold commemorative events. And when it comes to giving out honorary doctorates and degrees, the university seems to look at international athletes, pop stars, and actors. I've yet to have the university recognize and reward figures from military or the sort of military political leaders. Some may say we shouldn't be giving these to politicians, but some of them are both veterans and military and politicians. So I have to thank Daryl Cathcart for this. This is Daryl's pathway as to how you can build up a uniformed, friendly or military connected campus. And there's no doubt that we at Anglia Ruskin are very much down in the bottom left-hand corner. The P stands for phase, and we are really at the exploratory committee stage, and tomorrow we'll be trying to raise some faculty awareness. There are other universities around the UK and particularly in Scotland that have moved on a little bit, And of course, we know that in the States and in Canada, you're well up in the top right hand corner of this this graphic. So the ideal, well, it's everything I've talked about. We need admissions pathways, we need reduced entry requirements maybe, we need to support people through the curriculum, we need staff and student support and recognition. There needs to be some research in there. We need to have the appropriate facilities, and we need to start to develop staff and student associations. And perhaps in England, we quite like kite marks. So you can have a little rosette to say you're a 1-star campus or a 2-star campus. And we need some national or international recognition. And there are measurement tools out there. There are publications. It's heavily American biased, mainly because it talks a lot about the GI Bill and finances. But there are templates out there that can be used to measure how effective your campus is at being military connected or military friendly, armed forces friendly, whatever phrase you want to use. Now, I stole this slide because there was a leadership group held a couple of weeks ago, and they put up this slide, which is the sort of the university's synthesis of major global higher education trends. And they had these various boxes. And I looked at those and I thought, do you know what? A military connected campus really ticks all of those boxes. So if the university is looking to capturing the higher education trends globally, then developing a higher education campus that is military connected ticks all those boxes. So I will stop there now. Graham mentioned our hub. That's the website. I hope all of you have looked at that, and I hope even more that all of you have seen that and registered to use it. And at this point, I'll stop sharing, and Graham and I can now open ourselves up to questions.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, and thanks very much, Graham, for that overview, and also Mike for that synthesis about how to progress, or how you believe what the opportunities are to progress in England. We've got a couple of comments. One was your good friend and colleague Daryl Cathcart, who you mentioned, responded and said that he got one good idea from you, which was about the honorary doctorates. He hadn't thought of that, so he gives you a thumbs up for that.
We've got lots from him. So to be thanked for one is nice to hear. Yeah.
And another comment here, also from Canada, which was about that they have a MNET, which is a National Occupational Code equivalency tool that helps to translate the military occupational structures and qualifications in the military to civilian occupations and job openings. And the tool is connected to the National Job Bank. So that's an interesting concept that you might want to be thinking about, I guess, as a tip. And I'll use that to ask you a question in a minute. It goes on, the tool is only available on the Canadian Forces internal networks. However, you can find out more information and they give the link. So for those of you who are online, we'll post that link when we send out the material if you are interested in logging into that and having a look. But I guess the question that it raised when you were talking about it, that's appropriate to ask at the moment is you talked about that while you're in the military, your military qualifications continue to be regarded as active, even if it was a program you did 10 or 15 years before. But you leave as a veteran and they're time limited, or the half-life kicks in around the recognition. I guess there's two questions came to mind of why that might be. But how, I think to a point is how as we move forward, do we take those things, and maybe it's up to the institution, i.e. the university, the higher ed institution, to frame how it wants to look at those things. So in other words, does it need to be limited by convention, or does it have the ability to say we will look at those things and we'll consider them within a wider framework?
In the UK, a lot of it is, and on the admission side, is run nationally through this UCAS system. So that the answer is going to be a little bit of both, in that there needs to be a bit of a national push to get universities to accept and recognize military qualifications. The military need to get some of their qualifications recognized. Now, for example, the military for a long time trained, I'll speak about what I know. The military for a long time trained combat medical technicians, which were pretty much like paramedics. They were trained to put chest drains in and do tracheotomies and do lots of stuff. But the military were quite frightened of having their training accredited as paramedics, because it meant that it was easy for the combat medical technician to leave and immediately become a paramedic on the local ambulances. So it wasn't in the military's interest to have that course accredited. I've spent a lot of my time doing aeromedical evacuation. We have a superb training scheme for aeromedical evacuation, but none of that is accredited because the military can't afford to spend the time or the money to get it recognized by an academic body, by a university. So whoever does that course, when they leave, it counts for nothing in the outside world because it hasn't got. So the military themselves need to recognize that actually getting some courses may be retention positive, and they need to strike a balance. But each university can still make up its own rules about what it wants to have for entering their course. So a university can say, well, I will accept, because somebody has done a career in the military or they're a military child, we can reduce the admission criteria under those circumstances. There's nothing to stop them doing that. But there's always a fear of diluting because they don't understand it. But you have to start somewhere. So I think it's a combination of the military getting their act together and getting courses accredited properly. It's the government having the UCAS system have boxes that will have the right approach for people to have their qualifications recognized, and the university to say, despite all of the above, we will still recognize that if somebody's been a senior NCO in a forward operating base in Afghanistan, they must have learned some life skills, management skills, and clearly can do a job.
I would add to that having worked in the Army's Directorate of Education Training Services, it's called something else now, but I was involved in language training and assessment. But next door to me were the guys that worked on the accreditation of military qualifications. And from what I could gather, it is fiendishly difficult. So not only, I mean, the onus is very much on the MOD to work with education institutions, as I said in one of those slides at the outset, to ensure that's the case. I know that there's a project going on in Scotland at the moment, and Jerry and Jim, who I know are on this webinar from Scotland, may well have talked about this in their own presentation, but certainly involved in this and doing work on this. That effort is ongoing, but it isn't necessarily that straightforward, quite apart from the sorts of fears that may be in play that Mike mentioned. So that's one issue. And in terms of the timing out, I think even within the military there is a timeout. So if you did if you went to when you go to Sandhurst as an Army officer cadet and then commission, that course will enable you to it is already mapped to civilian qualifications, but I think you have to, I don't know, press a button on those or do whatever has to happen within a certain period of time, even when you're serving. So it's not just when you leave they time out. Also, you know, you have to be alive to that when you're serving as well. And addressing the role that HEIs can play in terms of looking at military qualifications and perhaps doing their own sort of mapping and reduction in entry requirements. I did a master's in education through the Open University, and for previous qualifications that I had achieved in the military, I only had to do, you know, 2/3 of the coursework, if you like. So HEIs are doing that, but I think it's not necessarily that easy, but it needs to be done, certainly.
I guess a follow on to that is what role do you think universities and higher education institutions have in not waiting for defence or the military to do the work, but actually engaging defence in this conversation about and offering assistance to perhaps to defence to undertake the work. So rather than saying, well, you do the work, what do you think do you think there is a role for universities and higher ed institutions to be more active in engaging with them around, well, what can we do to help you to facilitate this?
I think, I mean, that should certainly be a consideration. I think it'd be a very good idea. But again, speaking from experience, if every institution in England, not to mention the UK, kind of rang the MOD, the one person, the desk officer, and said, right, we want to do this, that desk officer, you know, a major or whoever it is, maybe a half colonel, full colonel at most, just wouldn't be able to cope with it. So I think we need to think differently and more intelligently about this. And it's a resourcing issue in terms of the MOD, you know, how much time and how much financial sort of resource can they throw at this? Those are questions I can't answer because I'm not in uniform, I'm not in the MOD anymore. But yeah, we need to think more cleverly about this, certainly. I'd urge MOD to do it.
And it's the churn. It's not only the fact that it's a lot of these things take more than one turn of the handle of the person in that post. In the UK, most posts rotate every 2 years, and to try and get some of these courses accredited is longer than a 2-year project, and that's not attractive to your middle grade officer. He's not going to win any plaudits by doing that. And to be honest, I think the military is a bit of a black box to a lot of higher education institutions. There are a few people in the university that understands the inner workings of the military, but they are relatively few and far between, and it just looks like a black box to the and to some extent vice versa as well. There are people in the military who understand the universities, but as a proportion of the whole, they're very, very few and far between.
Around the same topic, from Jerry, your colleague in Scotland, Jerry said, thank you for an informative session. And she says, did I hear right that you don't have a military course, military courses recognised in the same way we have in Scotland? Was that what you were talking about when you...
No, I mean, some are, and it depends on the university and the degree that you're applying for. And if you're a veteran, it depends, as we've said, it depends how long ago you did that course. But there are courses in the military that are fantastic. I always say the average life of a reservist in terms of their reserve service is about 5 years. And if you come in from scratch as a professional, and you go through all your basic training, your level 2 training, you go on some leadership courses. After 5 years, you will have done, if you do the minimum, which is 27 days in the UK as a reservist, you do 27 days as a minimum to get your bounty and so on. After 5 years, you've probably done the equivalent amount of training that you probably would have gone through for a master's, but you get nothing for it. There is no certificate or diploma to say all that training you've done has been of value, either to you personally or to your employer. So it's not that no military training is credited towards higher education. I'm just saying that there's a lot of other training going on that isn't. And universities recognize some, they don't recognize others, and it times out.
Mm-hmm. Another question here, Mike, in your presentation, you had that graph, and this is going back to military connected children, where you showed about 50% in the general population go on to university or higher ed. And then you had the second column where you showed that it was probably about 25%, so another half of that. So the question is confirming that it was that 25% of military connected children out of the full 50 currently progress to higher ed. And you talked about the lack of research, but what are your thoughts about how or what could universities do to lift that rate?
Well, as I said, I suspect some of it is an accounting error, because if your parents left the military at the time you filled in that UCAS form and they were working for Tesco's or Walmart or British Airways, then you won't tick the box to say that you're a military child. You'd say that your dad worked for British Airways. And so it could be an accounting error accounts for some of the gap. Some of it may be that we don't advertise and attract well enough the military child, that a lot of military children do join the military, and they may see that going to higher education is not necessarily what they want to do. They could go straight to Cranwell or Sandhurst or something like that, because that's what their dad did or their mum did. But I think what we need to do is, as I said, is make the pathway into university more attractive, starting with adverts, having taster weeks, summer camps for military children. But I would include in not just military children, I would have spouse and veterans as well, to demystify some of the myths that surround universities.
Another question here is, and it's a two-part question, and it's the intro is higher education institutions undoubtedly question the impact of becoming military connected campus. So obviously it doesn't appeal to everybody. But the first part of the question is what do we know about the larger campus society's understanding and or oppression of military connected students? So this is around the institution themselves and their knowledge and understanding of this group, this population, whether they're, and I would call this the whole military connected group. So that's members, veterans, spouses, partners, and children. So what are your thoughts about that?
I'll just kick off very quickly. I think it's limited in using our own HEI as the example. And that's why we are giving this presentation in advance of doing the same to our hierarchy tomorrow. We need to kickstart that sort of understanding. If we're to fulfill our commitments to the Armed Forces Covenant, as I put up in one of my slides, we need to do more. And I don't want to say we're just paying lip service at the moment, because we're not. There are some pockets of the university that are, really attempting to push the agenda, but it's limited, and it takes the wider institution and particularly the leadership to understand the military connected community and all it offers in order to really sort of buy into that and push it. And that's why we're presenting tomorrow. And Mike will undoubtedly want to add to that.
Yeah, I think there are, which is why I think words are important. I think some people are innately anti-military and feel universities should be separate from the military. And why would we want to have our university flying the flag and calling it and I think there's a group of that. There's a group of people who when you start to talk about the potential for recruiting students, getting involved with cadets and moving them into the university, getting involved with the local reserve units, you can see a bit of a veil falling from their eyes. Now that veil may be replaced by dollar signs because they see that there's a market out there. And I'm still in the belief that whichever university gets its act together and wraps something up that it can sell to children, spouse, veterans, reservists, then they may be able to make money out of that group. And some parts of the university, that's how they see it. There are other parts that would say, well, actually, we can run a better university because our completion rates, if we take on veterans and regulars and reservists, then they are in the main completer finishers. They're people who once you start are trained to reach the finishing line. So it may do better in terms of their completion rates, which is a KPI for universities. The answer is, I'm not sure we know the answer to that because nobody's really measuring it. But you need to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. The second part of the question goes on, if we're trying to help military connected students transition to civilian life and perhaps integrate, to what extent does uniquely identifying our military connected students undermine or hamper those efforts? Or from your work, and Graham, I mean, you're a great case example in your own, story, or does it not matter at all?
I mean, that's a really, really astute point, if that doesn't sound condescending. I was involved in a presentation earlier on today about something slightly different, but one of the points that was made, in fact, I made it, was that not every veteran, might identify themselves as a veteran in terms of that term. They may not feel comfortable with that term. We can call it, they might like to be called something else, former serving service person or former member of the armed forces or whatever, because they might think that veteran is uniquely sort of, Second World War, someone in the 90s or whatever. So that's the first sort of issue. It's contested. So, what do we call these people? Do we call them student veterans? Do we call them veteran students? Do we call them veterans? Do we call them something else? So some people just don't want to, play that game or have any part in that. And absolutely addressing the point that they are transitioning and that they might have considered the military experience as a stepping stone to what they will be doing in HEI, and from there, what they might be doing in employment, etc. It is just a stepping stone. They choose not to focus on that or to look back at it too much because it doesn't identify them. So there are people that are undoubtedly not necessarily going to be comfortable with being labeled veterans or be cast as something different and something other because they served in the military. That's a really important point. I hadn't considered in this, but that's really well made. In my own case, I think I probably, because of the circumstances I left the armed forces in through medical discharge, I felt a bit bruised, if you forgive the pun, as a result of that. And I wanted to sort of distance myself from an organization that I felt had kind of, let me down, rightly or wrongly. I've now, come back into the fold, and I realized what it did provide me in terms of skills and knowledge and experience. And I firmly believe that, part of what that has done for me means that I can take that into my current role in the HEI and be more effective than I might otherwise be without that experience. And so it is something to celebrate and something to sell. And so, those who wish to take advantage of that, I think, need us to fly the flag for them. And that's what we intend to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess what you've both talked about there was another thing that came or resonated with me when, Mike, you were talking about in your part of the presentation about transition. And the question I had was that, what role do you think university has in facilitating good transitions? Is that a role for universities, and what role could universities play in that? And you talked about the educational component, and you also alluded in your presentation to, some of those what I would call broader supportive issues about building the context or the framework, linking externally. I think I can't remember what you call them. Key partners is how I describe it, to build this inclusive network. So what do you think is the opportunity or the role of universities here?
I think the opportunity is there. As I said, the sort of transition bit is run by the Career Transition Partnership. And by definition, the career to me implies we're going to help you get a job. It doesn't really say we're going to transfer you into an educational institute, despite the fact that 20% of leavers, when asked, recognize that they need further training or further education to move into the civilian world or the job that they want. So I think the universities can and should reach into the CTP process, the career transition process, to say, this is not you don't walk out of the wire and suddenly you're a civilian. We can actually facilitate your transition from the year before you leave, through letting you know the courses that we can run, the qualifications that you've already accrued. This is the course that would suit you. And when you leave us 3 years later with a degree, you're not just somebody who's leaving Anglia Ruskin University with a degree in engineering. You're somebody who's leaving Anglia Ruskin University with a degree in engineering and 10 years of military experience of working with the engineers in austere environments. And your sellability to a employer with that background is going to be so much greater than you walking out of the gates and trying to get a job, because we can facilitate that so much better. And we can provide all the support network with the housing, the health service, the creche, and so on, that will actually make that smoother. Now, if you don't want to declare yourself, and actually, we've all met people who were pilots in the Royal Air Force and suddenly want to be doctors, and they go to medical school, and they want to forget being the RAF pilot, and they just go to medical school, and they come out as a doctor, and that's great. They've got their head in that space, and they've planned their transition. But I don't think we give the service leaver the right opportunities to show them this fairly rosy corridor that they could walk down with all the support, the part-time employment, the housing. And as I say, I think from the university's point of view, one of their KPIs again is, do people complete their degrees and do they get employed when they leave? And I think taking on a veteran is potentially less risky than taking on an 18-year-old straight out of school. Mm-hmm. And I'll add one more thing. I've been teaching students for 40 years. You put one mature student in a group, the quality and behavior of that group improves phenomenally. And I've had veterans that I've taught. I've even had American veterans, ex-Cobra pilots, who want to become doctors. You put one of those in a small group teaching, and the whole quality of that group is uplifted.
Another question here is about the ambassador thing, but before we ask it, because I think there's an earlier piece, and we've heard this in a couple of the other presentations, I think Daryl's and one of the others, was about this thing that, and Graham, you alluded to it, I think, in your presentation, about how do we educate the staff and faculty, on the military culture and experience, etc., of these military connected students, because that's quite important. I would have thought that to have some sort of, not detailed understanding, but some sense of, you know, what makes these people tick and why they're slightly different and so on. So A, do you think that's important? And B, how do you go around doing that? And Graham, you've taken on this role as the champion within Anglia Ruskin. So how do you might a university of higher ed institution might go about doing that?
I would link this to, because I can see the Q&A box, which I just opened up as well. And Anthony Moffat, I think, has asked a question: who are the benchmark military country and why? And I'd link the answer to your question there, Robert, to Anthony's there. I think we'd look to the US. I mean, I would look to the US. If I, in the role that I now find myself in, were asked to set up some sort of awareness training, then the first thing I'd do is look at the literature that has been produced in the States on that. Now, I know there are cultural differences between our two countries, as there are between any of our countries, but that would be the benchmark that I'd go to, and I'd draw on that, and I'd, you know, culturally align it to our own university, and perhaps produce, rather than reinventing the wheel, produce something drawn on that experience. That's all I say, because I think, look, I can see Mike sort of poised, ready to say something as well.
Well, I mean, it depends on which bit of the faculty and what bit of the military person they're going to be involved with. So the people who are looking at student admissions need a different bit of training than somebody who is supporting a student through the system. So I think you need a bit of bespoke training for different bits of the faculty as to what they need to understand about the military human, which somebody from York St. John does incredibly well. And he spends a whole day talking about what it's like to be in service, what it's like to transition, and what it's like to be a veteran. And how, therefore, you need not to be fearful of them. They're not all shouty, sweary, suffering from PTSD and so on. But they may have different views, the way they react and behave, not in a bad way, but just the things that they want out of the system. They want things, you know, to happen on time. The worst thing you can do to a veteran is offer him a teaching session and then not turn up on time, because he'll be there or she'll be there.
That leads into another thought that was triggered in my mind is that a role? You know, you alluded to that example, York St. John's. Is this a way in which we could use faculty who are veterans themselves or active reservists to be that leavening, to be those people to share that perspective with their colleagues in whatever faculty or school they happen to be within a university or a higher ed institution? Is that a role?
I mean, I would say absolutely, yeah. And I think that you're probably drawing on Carrie Townsend's question there. Now I've got the box up, I can see everything, so it makes the job a lot easier. Yeah, I think that would be, well, you know, I guess I have been appointed. I did kind of push the agenda slightly as well. There is a sort of, you know, self-promotion aspect, as I think most of us recognize in academia. People have got to know about you in order to sort of recognize that you've got something to offer, and, you know, that helps you progress. So it's a voluntary role, and I kind of, you know, came up with the title myself. But there is a really important altruistic point behind it, which I think we've addressed in spades. But you know, why me? Well, I've been through that process. I alluded to the fact that I left, you know, in relatively difficult circumstances in medical discharge. My recourse to deal with that was education. I think this goes back to the kind of what role that, you know, you mentioned before, Robert. What role does education play in transition? For me, it was an opportunity to introspectively examine the experience of transition from the military to civilian to civvy street, as we euphemistically call it. Via ill health, and work out, you know, and regroup and regain a bit of strength in a kind of nurturing environment, but also knowing that by investing in that education experience, it would make me stronger, both personally and professionally. Now, I've gravitated into an education environment professionally by virtue of that. But I think that to a degree makes me quite a passionate ambassador, if you like, to say, well, this is what it did for me. And I spent the MOD, the national financial help that I was given on an academic institution. I'm now working in an academic institution, hopefully effectively. So it's been a worthwhile investment. So, we're not all kind of drunken, sweary, uncouth pistols that Mike alluded to. We can think, we can reason, we can work hard, we do work hard, and we can be an asset to your institution. So I hope that I would be able to convince my organization that's the case, and maybe soften some of the sort of blunter edges that they might have in their mind about what the armed forces and veteran community comprises, and the attributes that they might fear they might bring with them, as Mike alluded to.
I suspect that if the university carried out a census, they would be surprised how many people within their faculty, within the facilities staff, within the admissions staff are military connected in one way or another. Because, as Graham said, there's 10 million people out there. So whether they are adult volunteers teaching the cadets twice a week, or they're reservists, or they're veterans themselves, I think the campus would probably have a shock. But they don't know, because we don't record that status. You are the only exception to that should be a reservist should tell his employer that he's a reservist, but the word is should, and it's not mandated that you have to. So people, I think the university would get a shock if it did a census, and probably find some of their key workers and very good employees are military connected.
Which goes back to Carrie's question, I guess, about is that something in your model that you've proposed, Mike, that you actually need to consider adding, which is actually some sort of active census or audit?
Well, part of the employer recognition scheme, there are 3 levels. There's bronze, silver, and gold. Bronze and silver are relatively easy to get. That's pretty much a tick box exercise. And by employing a veteran like Graham and a reservist like me, they've already ticked the boxes that they need to get a silver award. That's pretty easy. To get a gold award is a bit more complicated. And you do have to, A, know who you've got and demonstrate that you have been actively supportive. So you have to have terms of service as an employer that guarantees your adult volunteer who trains the cadets twice a week and wants to go away on a summer camp with them, you have to give them 2 weeks leave to do that. So by doing things like that, they have to have some form of census as an employer to know who they're employing, who are military connected. And yes, it's part of the system that should be there if they want to move up that employment recognition scheme.
But I was just thinking about, if we're talking about this, you talked about this military inclusive or military friendly campus concept. One of the things that would be useful is to know how many of your employees as potential resources to assist you in that process. And that was why I thought it linked back to Carrie's question about being ambassadors. So you might have the leader of the charge in Graham, for example, but you also know that there are 50 or 60 or 70 other staff members who can be recognised and who in their own way can be called on to provide that support and backup and what have you. Going on here, Jim Castle from Scotland has, just for those of you who are from England, Wales and Northern Ireland, that Scotland has the military connected network, Graham mentioned that. And the organisation is open to all UK universities and higher ed institutions. So we might send out that link. So if there are any of others that are on the line today who want to link in with that network, then they can do so. Another question here is, what is your advice on making universities aware of military connected students and veterans on campus? Students, both students to both staff and students, without othering the veterans and military connected community. For example, veteran students in the US have expressed that they do not disclose that they are vets because the stigma attached, and how people then make assumptions about them being broken. So what are your thoughts about that?
Sorry, go Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I did mention in the talk that just as we do health and safety for students and staff, and we do diversity and inclusion and so on, there's no reasons why you shouldn't or couldn't have a similar. I'm not one for increasing the number of mandatory training sessions we have to have, but just as we have 9 protected characteristics about gender and pregnancy and so on, then there's absolutely no reason why I think you shouldn't have something in there about veterans. But nothing I've said would make it compulsory that people have to recognise or identify themselves as veterans. The only point and the only reason why anybody would identify themselves as anything is if there's something in it for them to some extent. And if that can get you a part-time job because your anchor institution that recognises veteran service is linked with a part-time employer who will give you a favourable leg up because you're a veteran, then why wouldn't you? But it's going to be an individual choice. And just like the UCAS form has a box to tick, and you're encouraged to tick it because it says you will get extra support and you will be tracked, and any changes that you recommend will support people following you. You don't have to tick that box, and nobody's going to be any the wiser.
Yeah,
and I think the question is possibly also referring to the fact that you don't want to, if you are running an awareness session, you don't want to go overboard on the fact that some veterans may leave service with some physical or psychological issues. There's a narrative in the UK at the moment which intends and attempts to counter the mad, bad, and sad trope that exists in some of the media outlets in the UK, where particularly the sort of height of Afghanistan operations, etc., where people were coming back visibly, physically affected, and there was a narrative around the mental health piece, which led some in the UK wider population to think that every veteran was therefore completely bonkers, injured both mentally, physically, and a liability as a consequence. That clearly isn't the case, but there are, just as there are in any sector of society, there are some needs that might need to be considered, but you balance that and perhaps promote more strongly the assets and the strengths that population, the military connected population, will bring to the HEI, rather than majoring on the sort of care needs, for want of a better description.
There were 2 more things that I sort of came to mind, and one, if I go back one step, where we were talking about the staff and faculty. We heard in our very first session that kicked off this current conversation around role of education from Barrett Bogue and Andrew Morse on their research piece around the value of veterans as faculty and staff to higher ed and universities. And so one of the things that it triggered in my mind, and apologies, I should have asked this earlier, was we talk about attracting students, but do you see in the programs as we think about this, how do we make ourselves an attractive employer of high quality veterans or veterans who have high quality skills and capabilities that would add significant value to the university or the higher education institution. And what are your thoughts about that? Is that an opportunity? How might universities think about that?
Well, I think again, it's not just the veteran; it's the reservist and so on. And this is the kite marking I was talking about as to whether you're seen as a bronze, silver, or gold winner as an employer. So if you're a reservist, then you go to a gold award winner because you know you're going to get 2 weeks paid leave as an employee. Whereas if you go to another organization, you won't be given 2 weeks because they haven't crossed that Rubicon. If you're a veteran, some organizations guarantee you an interview because, and I'm not just talking about academic staff here, I'm talking about everybody in the university, because your CV may not be understandable to the lay reader, and therefore you're better to interview them and see how they are in the flesh than go on their CV. So the university can do all those things to improve the quality and applicants to their organization.
And I think it goes back to the ambassador question and point we made earlier as well, that I know, and Mike will remember 2 months ago, I discovered that one of our satellite facilities, if you like, in London, AIU's got a sort of satellite facility in London, is an element of it is headed up by a former warrant officer in the British Army, and he's quite, he's an author, he's quite active on Twitter, etc. A great ambassador for both the university and the armed forces. And if you bring the two together, that sort of ambassadorial role suggests to me that using those former members of the armed forces that are now working in an organization such as a university as ambassadors for that, which other organizations do, is a useful, a very powerful means of promoting that to other potential recruits from the armed forces community. So I'd like to see our institution doing more of that.
Apologies. I know Andrew and Barrett both commented about in terms of their, particularly that thing about the mayor's employees, either on teaching faculty or in the administrative roles within the university and higher ed. And what they were also talking about there was not just their educational component, but those other leadership and what we euphemistically call soft skills. So ability to work under pressure, decision making, team building, collaboration skills were seen as very highly valuable additive factors to them as an employee of the institution. And as I said, the reason I ask is because we focus a lot on veterans as students. We don't focus very much on them as what they would bring as an employee. And I include reservists here in that broader veteran service member context or military connected context, but that they're bringing as an employee to the institution. We're sort of coming to the end of our time, but I just want to end on another area that you raised, which I thought was very interesting, is about this community engagement you talked about and the role of higher ed in community engagement. And you may want to comment on that, but we've got another question that looks at around this community engagement. And the question is there any way that the Ministry of Defence or defence in other countries can be helped to see the need for them to promote their own staff and their capabilities from a more positive perspective and additive perspective to the wider community. So this community engagement, both the role of people like MOD, but also universities in terms of the sorts of things you were talking about, how important is that community engagement, do you think, ultimately?
I think the MOD is probably not as good as it could be in community engagement. It does try, but at the same time, it still hides behind the wire occasionally. So I don't think the MOD is a good example. And of course, in the UK, we have staff colleges and we have the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and things like that, but we don't have military universities in the way that some other countries do. So you can go to medical school in the military, in a military medical school in the States, I believe, and we don't have that kind of thing. So I think this is where the universities need to be more proactive, which is why I talked about the university engaging with the cadets and engaging with the local reserve units, and if necessary, engaging with the local garrison. And I think we can reach inward rather than expecting them to come out to us. But like Graham, they have their own education officers. But we, as I said, we have a policing institute and we have a reserve. The military prison in the UK is in Essex. It's on our patch, and they have a reserve unit, and we have the biggest apprenticeship police degree in the country. But I don't think, well, I know because I visited the reserve police unit 2 weeks ago, and there is no connection between our policing institute and them. So we have a bit of a blind spot that we can fill.
Yeah, I mean, the MOD reach into universities when they need those universities to provide particular courses as part of a service person career progression. For example, I'm, as a former British Army Education Training Service branch officer, I am now an external examiner on a University of Southampton course here in England that provides the postgraduate certificate of education for Army education officers. So they have outsourced that PGCE to Southampton University that runs it alongside its wider PGCE course. But this is a specific course run for the military cohort of around, I don't know, 5 to 10 education officers a year. And they do it over a couple of years, and they can go on to do a master's as well. And so the MOD, as I said at the outset of my presentation, other external providers of courses will provide courses to MOD personnel in service. There is a Defence Academy, which Mike alluded to, which will provide a sort of quasi-HE environment for service personnel as well, but it is quasi. It is not a traditional university, as Mike indicates. So it's limited. It's when need is needed, when the need is identified and needed, yes, otherwise limited.
Well, thank you very much, Mike and Graham, for a very interesting presentation. Hopefully, you've given some people food for thought, but equally, one of your objectives, of course, was to get some feedback on your presentation ahead of your pitch to the institution itself tomorrow. Hopefully, you've got a few things that will be helpful for that. And I want to say thank you for contributing to this broader conversation that we've commenced around the role of education, and that will be continuing. And for those of you online or watching this on delay, we've got an international working group that's been formed that will be carrying this conversation forward. And we look forward to having some more conversations in the second half of the year around this issue and particularly my personal hope is around how we support educational institutions, universities, higher ed, to develop this military connective supportive environment that reaches out into the broader community and starts to build those networks that Graham and Mike spoke about today. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We look forward to having you join us when the next we convene. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.